Good afternoon. Welcome to the annual meeting of YWCA Missoula. I'm Kathy Powell, President of the Board of Directors. I would like to thank everyone for taking time to join us virtually today and respectfully acknowledge that we are on ancestral lands of the Salish, Kootenai, and Kalispel people, and the many other Indigenous people who have passed this area. I'll begin today with a brief introduction, and then we'll turn it over to our Executive Director, Cindy Weiss, who will share her vision for the upcoming year. From there, we'll introduce new board officers, and finally, we will hear from our guest speaker, Lenny Peppers. At the end of the program, we will open chat for questions. 2020 was such a challenging year. As a healthcare provider, I truly feel that is an understatement. I am proud of the many ways that YWCA staff and board adapted to the circumstances that rose to these challenges. When COVID-19 hit Missoula last March, we responded quickly, making changes that allowed our essential programs to carry on without interruption. We continue to help homeless families find stable housing while navigating high unemployment, remote school, and an uncertain housing market. Staff at our domestic violence shelter implemented pod scheduling and new safety and quarantine protocols. Our GUTS program moved to a virtual platform, providing mentorship to girls and gender diverse youth across Montana. At the end of 2020, I am humbled to share that we surpassed our $8 million capital campaign to build the Meadowlark, our new home that will allow us to serve twice the number of homeless families and domestic violence survivors than we do currently. This is thanks to our incredible partnership with the Missoula Interfaith Collaborative and the generous support of over 1,000 donors. Secret Seconds thrift stores continue to be a thriving business enterprise. And despite the necessary closure of the stores for 6 weeks last spring, and the many challenges of operating a small business during a pandemic, Secret Seconds met its revenue benchmarks, providing crucial funding for our programs and significant in-kind contribution from community members in need. The income from our Secret Seconds stores, in addition to local, state, and federal grant funding, as well as contribution from our incredibly generous donors, allowed YWCA to serve more than 3,300 individuals this past year. These are adults and children right here in our community whose lives were directly impacted by your generosity. I consider this an amazing success. It is now my great pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of YWCA, Cindy Weiss.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for joining us. This past year delivered some big changes, from the ways we connect on a daily basis, thank you Zoom, to the operations of our programs during a pandemic, to the country's social and political landscape. And yet, the support from all of you and from others in this community has remained constant. For that, we are incredibly grateful. As Kathy mentioned, over 3,000 people were impacted by the YWCA this year. This includes 2,300 survivors of domestic or sexual violence and 409 homeless families. You can find more information in our annual report, which is available on our website. For many of the adults, children, and families we serve, having access to our services, support, and a safe place to live changed the course of their lives. And while it is important for us to change individual lives, we must also work to change the world in which we live. because the problems we address at the YWCA don't happen in a vacuum. Racism and gender inequality are root causes of the issues facing the people we serve. The overwhelming majority of domestic violence victims are women, with higher rates of violence and disproportionate impacts among Black, Indigenous, and other women of color. Domestic violence is a leading cause of family homelessness, and as a result, up to 70% of homeless families are headed by single mothers. And in Montana, BIPOC children experience the most severe homelessness, where they are staying in a shelter like ours, camping, or sleeping in their cars at 5 times the rate of white children. The COVID-19 crisis has highlighted and exacerbated these inequities. Since the pandemic started, women account for 55% of the total job losses in the country, and that percentage is increasing. In December, the United States lost 140,000 jobs, and all of the net losses were among women of color. As the challenges facing women and families in our community change, we have to listen and evolve to their needs, now more than ever. We are nearing completion of the Meadowlark, YWCA Missoula's home for our 2nd century of service. In just a few months, no parent in our community will have to tuck their children into the backseat of a car or the inside of a tent at night because they don't have money for rent. Domestic violence survivors will have a dignified place to stay and the trauma-informed support they need to heal and break the cycle of violence for their children. Individuals and families living in the Meadowlark will have private sleeping rooms, warm, healthy dinners, and access to a healthcare clinic and a legal assistance center. Gone will be the long wait list for our emergency housing rooms and limited stays at our domestic violence shelter. And the children staying in the shelters will have many opportunities to simply play carefree with other children. We are on track to complete construction of the Meadowlark in April and expect to move the first families into the building in May. We plan to hold an open house once construction is finished, so stay tuned for more information in the coming months. None of this would be possible without your support. If you made a financial gift to the YWCA or volunteered your time in the past year, thank you for being part of such an important mission. I also want to thank my incredible coworkers, including many who are frontline workers providing direct essential services. When the pandemic hit last March, our staff barely skipped a beat in continuing to provide in-person and remote assistance to those in need. The YWCA board also deserves recognition for their leadership during this milestone time in the organization. These women show up when asked, and they have been asked to show up a lot. 2 of them will be rolling off the board this year. Sabrina Strawbridge has been a supporter of the YWCA for over a decade and an active volunteer in our GUTS program, helping to organize multiple successful LunaFest events. She joined the board 5 years ago and is stepping off after finishing 2 terms. Cindy Nesselrode has been an active volunteer for over 13 years, past board president and a 3-term board member. She's volunteered on the front line, coordinated numerous fundraising activities, traveled across the country with staff to attend trainings, and has been a stellar ambassador for the YWCA. Thank you to both these women for their outstanding service to the YWCA. Now I'm going to pass the mic back to Kathy, who will introduce our new board officers for 2021.
Thank you, Cindy. Now I'd like to introduce this year's new board officers. I, Kathy Powell, will serve a 2nd term as board president. Miranda Ming, immediate past president. Helia Jazzieri, vice president. Jenny Clark, treasurer. And Rachel Durkin, secretary. Thank you to our new board leadership. I am now pleased to introduce Lanata, Lenny Peppers, our guest speaker. Lenny is Northern Cheyenne and Crow and is of Laguna Pueblo ancestry. She spends her days to tell stories from an Indigenous perspective through comedy, filmmaking, art, poetry, photography, fashion, music, and writing. Lenny, take it away.
YWCA and guests. I begin with a poem. I don't understand those who can ignore politics, because as a Native woman, every single action I do is politicized. If I mother, it is resistance. If I write, it is defiance. And if I speak, it is survivance. The fact that I exist is due to the political actions of my ancestors. I've accepted this honored invitation to talk to you today about how our bodies are tied to the land so deeply. You can see its pain reflected in the very lives of the women who exist in those places. I will do this with my personal history, or should I say, herstory. The event of violence does not begin with me. Sadly, it more than likely will not end with me either. Despite this fact, I intend to do everything in my power to lessen the ways in which it impacts my children. I do not need to look into the past to witness the connections between colonization and violence. I'm here before you all today, holding the experience of it in my heart. My heart pumps it through me. It flows in my blood. The very blood that I shared with each of my 6 children when they were growing inside of me. The very blood that my own mother nourished me and her mother nourished her before. Our stories, like our blood, were shared between mother and child from generation to generation, by memory, or should I say by heart. I personally know the story of every woman back for 5 generations in my family. My great-great-grandmother was found dead on the railroad tracks near what is now Wyola, Montana. I am proof that she existed. But her story is important because we still see people murdered along railroads throughout the country over and over again. This specific railway connects violence against our bodies to violence against the earth. It is a literal scar on the land, showing how environmental exploitation doesn't just change the local landscape. Scars like that railroad are the unjust geographies to the land where my people lived for thousands of generations. My great-grandmother, or as I call her, Grandma Tala, was an infant when she lost her mother and was given to her young aunt to be raised. The loss of her mother made her a victim of murdered and missing Indigenous peoples before anyone knew what to call it. But even back then, it was a thing. The aunt took my great-grandmother to different women throughout the community every day to nurse her, and she survived. I am proof that she existed. She grew to mother my grandmother. In her time, a dam marked the land and left a mark in the historical timeline of our history where electricity became more valuable than life itself. My grandmother, Dorothea, or Grandma Dorothy as I call her, had many children. One of those children, of course, was my mother. My mother, known to me simply as Mom, was kidnapped when she was only 5 years old, and thus both her and my grandmother became victims of murdered and missing Indigenous people. Continuing the chain of women personally affected by this thing, still unnamed at that moment in time when my Grandma Dorothy lost her children. In her time, coal became more valuable than water. Poem. I wish that I could say that everyone has a choice, live or die, but nothing is ever all the way black or white like that. We all live in the clouded murk in the middle, gloomy, grim, and gray, and we drink it down every day. But there is a problem with the water under the Crow Res. They said, don't scare the people, but it's contaminated with something that causes cancer. You have to drink it for years, they comforted me. Mostly old people should see a doctor if they have pain in their stomach. Comforting pat on the shoulder, a smile suggesting kindness, and behind it, cavernous jaws leak poison into my ears. Does that make you feel better? No, not me. I'm old, and sometimes my stomach hurts. Later, I sat in the kitchen and watched my girl make her newborn a bottle. How many years does it take? How much water? That baby's tiny, and the water is the main ingredient in the diet that sustains her. I sent money to Flint last year, tried to delude myself into thinking that doesn't happen here, as if this reservation were different from the others, as if the government, our leaders, anyone would care if our water was contaminated. I laughed to myself. They didn't. They don't. My stomach hurts, and IHS doesn't have the budget to save us. So I take an aspirin, and I try to sleep. My mother, brilliant and resilient, survived to become a state legislator for 8 years. She survived to become a doctoral candidate today with me, where we're pursuing this together. And I have no doubt, eventually, she will run for the Montana Senate in 2022. She raised me to speak up and step up. And while she probably didn't realize it, she raised me to remember and erase history and re-remember it to my own children so that they know how to adjust to and thrive because of the memories that we carry in our hearts. I was taught that empowerment is brought about by individual healing, but also that healing must be to function as an integral part of creation. They are creating our future with their voice and their existence. The fact that we are here undermines the violence actively imposed upon us, while at the same time embodying resilience and healing. By remembering and retelling our story, we offer an alternative conception of history, and more importantly, futurity. What I just told you is my map. The map that connects our bodies to history, the linear connections that I have to our history of violence and resilience. For some, these stories have been forgotten. That is by design. Colonial forms of amnesia work to regulate Native peoples as non-existent or even as victims. It demands a remembering of nostalgic past, an erasure of the violence in which this country was built upon. That is not my point here. My intention is to create a movement of re-remembering so that we can have a foundation of truth to press forward in our work toward equality, and justice for both human and land alike. While these stories are embedded in my memory, I understand that this issue didn't begin with me, just as I understand that it didn't begin with my great-great-grandmother. This had been a problem for hundreds of years before my great-great-grandmother had been given our matriarchal blood flow and survived just long enough to pass it on. Today, we can part the temporal past in the chart of the resistance of murdered and missing Indigenous people and pinpoint the exact time and location where Native people and Native bodies become the conduit of violence in America. Essentially, we can plot the source of the echo of settler structures of violence on our bodies. We can open an actual map, and plot the points on that map to where unjust geographies exist and where violence against our murdered and missing Indigenous people. And we could trace that back to about 6 or 7 a.m. on October 12th, 1942, on an island in the Bahamas, the Indigenous peoples called Guanahani. We can connect the violence against us with violence to our lands. I'm not here to tell you how we're going to change the world. It's up to each and every one of us to figure that out. And let me tell you, I ain't even close. I call on laughter to fight through comedy. I call on knowledge to fight through my work in academia. I call on my voice to fight in my activism and art. And I call on my memory of those women in my life to keep me strong so that I can keep up the fight. I can't claim, nor am I tending to tell you how to fix it. Besides, they only gave me 15 minutes. However, I will end here with one more poem and with a reminder that the physical violence to our lands will almost always end up with physical violence against our Indigenous peoples. Places in our community, like the YWCA, create safe spaces for our city's women and children to thrive and heal from trauma that is sometimes generational. It creates spaces for voices to be heard and mouths to be nourished. And most importantly, it allows for space for futurity to become possible. Poem. Hundreds of puffs wisp across the sapphire prairie sky. My grandmother bends her long legs so that she crouches at my 5-year-old apex. Together, we look up. The bison are marching across the sky today. She giggled because she knew she blew my mind right then. At 39, I can still smell her, and I know exactly who I was when she pointed out the fluffy cloud buffalo herd that marches across the sky to remind us that we are still here. We know because we can see them from this place. You see, where I came from, the past, present, and future all exist at once. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenny, for sharing your powerful presentation with us today. I think that your inspirational words are a reminder that the mission of the YWCA is just as important today as it was when the doors opened 110 years ago. So thank you so much. We have a few minutes left, and so we're going to open the chat and take a few questions. If you have questions for Lenny or Kathy or me, please put them in the chat and we'll do our best to address them. And Lenny, I'm going to start. I have a question for you while we're waiting for some others. Do you have other projects that you're working on right now?
I have a couple of projects. I'm currently on break from comedy, but I do have 2 podcasts, one called Social Justice Weirdos, where we talk about social justice from a more fun and comical point of view. And then we have Hourgasm, where we talk about sexuality and gender through decolonizational theory.
That's wonderful. What was the name of that podcast?
Hourgasm. And of course, I'm still working on my PhD over at the university. And so just always learning.
Wow, it sounds pretty incredible. Your plate is full and yet you're being very creative. And again, I really appreciate you sharing your story with us today. We do have some questions coming in. Oh, here's one, and it's for you, Lenny. Can you tell us what your PhD will be about?
Yes, I will be working on tribal critical theory through art and media. And so basically, I'm just looking at Native representation in art and media, and mostly film and literature.
Wonderful. So we have a question, and I think I can address this one. Someone wants to know who will be eligible to stay at the Meadowlark and for how long. That's a really good question. I first will say that our Meadowlark has 3 wings. The center wing will be home to the YWCA Program Center, staff and administrative offices. The east wing will house the YWCA's new expanded domestic violence shelter, and that shelter is eligible for adults and children, women and men, fleeing violent homes, where they can stay for really as long as they need to be able to transition into safe homes of their own. And we will have 13 private rooms available for survivors in that wing of the building. And then I'm excited to announce that our west wing in the building is going to house the new Missoula Family Housing Center, which will be jointly operated by the YWCA and Family Promise, a program of the Missoula Interfaith Collaborative. And that wing will have the ability to house up to 31 homeless families, and that's 1 or 2 parent families who have dependent children. And while people will be able to stay, and families will be able to stay as long as they need to make sure that they can transition out of the Family Housing Center into homes of their own, we anticipate that the average stay will be around 45 to 60 days. Okay, let's see. Lots of thanks coming in for your story, Lenny. Here's a question for you. How can we teach our children to be allies and social justice advocates?
Yeah, so the best way to teach is to do. And so by learning about your community and the history of your community, and finding organizations like the YWCA and contributing and volunteering as a family is really the best way to go about doing that.
And it looks like we have one more question, and looks like folks are asking about items that they can donate, or what do we need at the Meadowlark. We obviously will need donations from the community. We are in a situation where we have very generous community members and donors and very limited storage space at the Meadowlark. And so what we are going to be working on is a wish list that will be posted on our website and in various places, so that community members can click on that and see the items that we need. We know that our needs will change depending on the families living in the center at the time, and so we will be updating that constantly. So that is all the time we have today. Again, thank you, Lenny. Thank you, Kathy Powell, our board president, and thank you all for joining us for this year's annual meeting. With your help, we will continue our work to end domestic and sexual violence, change the lives of homeless families, and transform Missoula into a place where anyone, regardless of their race or their gender, can pursue their dreams safely and free from discrimination. Have a great week, everyone.